thinking too about your theoretical roots and your philosophical frameworks and how this informs your activism. But why is it important to understand the historical roots of testing? And how does this history inform the sociological impacts and contemporary politics of schooling and especially educational inequality? So, and we're also especially curious about how testing intersects with the evolving class and say the racial structure of US society, especially we think within the post-pandemic movement, where you have, I believe it was the UC schools are no longer right requiring the
Yeah,
SAT. So all
UC,
it's shifting, yeah.
it's shifting. Yeah, no, the major victories recently, UC's ditched the SAT and the ACT, and actually same with University of Washington. That was much less publicized, but that happened. I didn't even know it happened until 3 or 4 days after it happened here in Washington, which is mind blowing to me. Um, yeah, I mean, so if you think back to what I said earlier about how I see education and critical consciousness, then really I'd say that sort of shapes all of my scholarship, right? Including my work on high stakes standardized testing, um, because what I really want, what that project did for me was it helped increase my consciousness, but in publishing that work and in speaking about it, and I still end up doing a lot of work around that. Um, is it like the goal of that is to get folks to develop really a meta historical conceptual theoretical political understanding of the tests, right, just from the beginning. That's what it's about. um, because much like a lot of other things in education, people just take testing for granted. It's part of a common sense way of measuring education, and people, generally folks like just operate on the assumption that the test scores are meaningful in particular ways. They just assume, right? Oh, you get good test scores, then you're smart. It means it's a good school. It means it's a good teacher. It means it's a good neighborhood. It's a good place to buy a house. There's all these meanings we attach to those test scores, and people just don't think about it. And so that whole project to me was just to kind of to really try and peel back the veil around testing so folks could understand it in all these different ways. And so I think it's important within that vein. I think it's important then historically for folks to really understand that that the paradigm these tests are built on is one purely of inequality, right? Like they're built to create inequality. That's why I named the book Unequal by Design. It's a model of the world that assumes, number one, that intelligence exists on a bell curve, and that's built into us biologically, right? There's an actual biological concept of IQ that folks who build tests work off of, because any good test, any good measurement for them is only accurate if it produces an unequal bell curve of who does well and who does poorly and who's in the middle, right? And so then if that's at the heart of it, and you put that in the context of capitalism and this whole idea of education around in class reproduction, and then you overlap race, on top of that as well, right? So you get to see how actually, these tests end up being this vehicle for, literally reproducing class relations and white supremacy in this country, right? And doing so in very concrete ways. And so historically, then I think it's helpful for folks. They don't even know, like when you go back to these early psychologists, Terman and Yerkes and all these folks, they're like they had totally racist and sexist and classist notions, and they thought their objective tests, they thought their tests were objective, and that these tests showed objectively, right, that poor people were dumber than rich people, and that immigrants were dumber than those born in the U.S., and that brown people were dumber than white people. Like they thought they found the magic key, to explain all this stuff. And it also was very much tied to the eugenics movement in the United States at the time, right? And also was the founding of tracking. We still have international baccalaureate programs and AP programs and gifted programs and highly capable programs now, and that goes back 100 years to these same tests. And really the idea that a lot of people thought, oh, not all these kids are smart enough and good enough to go to college. They need to be put into lower tracks and trained to go work in the workforce, right? And so that's why I think it's important for folks to understand this history so they can make sense of what's happening now. Because, when you get down to it, if you look at the results of all of our high-stakes standardized tests now, it's basically a mirror of 100 years ago, right? You still got, for the most part, poor kids doing worse than rich kids, kids of color, particularly black and brown kids, doing worse than white kids and affluent kids, right? ELL students, not doing as well as native English speakers. It's all there, and so and I think one, just as sort of an aside, in Marxist terms, I'm actually trying to think through something right now. It's another paper I want to do, because we still don't have an explanation of what the tests actually measure, right? We know they don't measure learning, right? And we know that because even if you take the test scores sort of as a real measure of something, statistically, right? Like basically, depending on the study you look at, around maybe up to 75 or 80% of any test score is statistically based on non-school factors, right? So you might have 25 to 20% happening over here in the school, and then within that, the teacher, again, for whatever the test score actually means, the statisticians look at that and they do their, they have their value-added formulas and stuff, which are a whole other podcast worth of discussion. They end up finding that, even the most influential teacher might contribute to like 15% of any test score, right? And so then you have to ask this question, like, what are we measuring, right? If it's not what's happening in a school, which means it's not really about teaching and learning, and we don't really have a good answer to that. And so I actually think that Marxism has some answers to that, in the sense that if you look at I'm starting to think that maybe the test scores actually are measuring the resources that it takes to put into class reproduction, right? And that's become a reflection of that. And so the students that are coming from working class families, and maybe the parents haven't gone to university, right? It's just measuring the amount of social labor that's gone into reproducing them, and that's the score you get out of that. Versus the kids who come from the super affluent families, that is measuring everything that's got into them, and they have these higher scores. So that's another argument I'm thinking about that I want to take up and sort of really explore as part of this. What's the